Jeremy Story, Police Chief. First of all, thank you for being here on a non-council Wednesday or Monday for this special work session. I know those are valuable and they don't come up very often. I want to start with a couple stories from last week, and I do want to say thank you to everyone that attended our town hall. It was a good turnout and a lot of good questions and discussion. And this may not seem related to what we're talking about today, but there is a nexus, and unfortunately all these things tend to intertwine with each other, and they don't happen in a silo. The issues with addiction, the issues with homelessness and crime all have some overlap. So immediately after the town hall for crime reduction, one of our deputy chiefs and a lieutenant was in the back parking lot, the employee parking lot, talking for a little bit when they heard the sound of glass breaking. They moved around to the side of the building, that south side, when one of our facilities managers ran out of the building as well, and someone had thrown a rock through the city hall window to that office. They were able to eventually get a good description off the video, find the subject at the south end of the downtown mall, and arrest him for felony criminal damage to property. It's about a $1,600 window. The point for this incident is that this person is no stranger to us or to many of the people in the city that deal with these types of issues. And in fact, many of the issues he has do center around solicitation. And I'm just gonna kind of go through this. This is just from 2023 and 2024, the incidents that he's been involved in. Many of these are violent crimes. I'll give you a few incidents. Just randomly looking up 4 or 5. There's one where he asked somebody for a lighter, he solicited for a lighter, and he threw a rock and hit him in the head when he said no. He spit on a citizen over off the Loman Walton area, doing the same thing. He attacked a customer with a baton and hit them in the head. He attacked another customer at a different business and ended up shattering the window to a vehicle that there's 2 babies inside. Now, not everybody has this extensive of a history, but there are too many people in Las Cruces. And there's a number of things implicated by this, of course, competency being one of them. Some of the other issues with releasing people when they already have existing conditions of release for new offenses. But it also plays into this because many of the behaviors we're seeing at our businesses and other places are these aggressive, violent behaviors, not just from this gentleman. And to top it all off, mostly for irony, at the same time this was happening on the east parking lot, a second incident was happening where we have a warrant operation for felony warrants that's funded by the state. They saw someone that they were looking for who also fits the same type of repeat offender demographic. He fled straight to City Hall, where he was eventually taken into custody in the front parking lot. So you had those 2 incidents happening at the same time after our town hall. To get into the meat and potatoes of why we're here, I'm going to start with the solicitation ordinances. These, again, are already existing ordinances. We're looking to modify them to do 2 things primarily. One is to remove potentially unconstitutional language and to really focus and narrow that focus to a public safety interest. The changes in both 21-62 and 21-63 are fairly minor overall as they stand now. And this is kind of just an overview of what we have to accomplish with the solicitation ordinance. It has to be neutral in content, meaning that if we enforce it for panhandling, we have to enforce it for somebody that's potentially doing a car wash or that's soliciting for a fundraiser or a funeral. It has to be neutral in content. Another thing is it has to be narrowly tailored. So the more specific the restrictions are, the more likely it will be upheld. The more broad it is, the less likely it will be upheld in court. Leave open ample alternative channels of communication. And this one is really important to serve a significant government interest that is pressing and legitimate. In this case, primarily public safety. And depending on what we're talking about, whether it's on aggressive panhandling or panhandling around roadways where it becomes dangerous, public safety is what we're after with these ordinances. So we'll start with 21-62, which is prohibited solicitations. This is how it reads currently as a draft. It shall be unlawful for any person to solicit money or other things of value or to solicit the sale of goods or services in the manner described in subparagraphs 1 through 3 of this section. I'm going to go through 1 through 3 individually. So I'm going to forgo reading it in its entirety, but there's 3 separate ways that this ordinance would be implicated. The first one is solicitation is prohibited in an aggressive manner in a public area or on private property within the city limits. So then the question is, what does aggressive mean? And I apologize ahead of time, I'm going to go through several slides for the definition of aggressive. That's currently in 21-61 of the ordinance. There's 6 different ways that the word aggressive could come into play and meet the requirements of the ordinance. The first is intentionally or recklessly making any physical contact with or touching another person in the course of the solicitation without the person's consent. Now, this would already be a crime of battery, but that's the first condition of aggressive. Second is following the person being solicited. That's the key. Following the person if, that's an important if, that conduct is intended to or is likely to cause a reasonable person to fear imminent bodily harm or the commission of a criminal act upon property in the person's possession, or is intended to or is reasonably likely to intimidate the person being solicited into responding affirmatively to the solicitation. Now, you're going to see those two things kind of repeat through the definition, but this first one is doing either one of those while following the person. The next way it could be aggressive panhandling is continuing to solicit within 5 feet of the person being solicited after the person has made a negative response, if continuing the solicitation is intended to or likely to cause a reasonable person to fear imminent bodily harm or the commission of a criminal act upon property in the person's possession, or is intended or is intended to or is reasonably likely to intimidate the person being solicited into responding affirmatively to the solicitation. So following the person, continuing to solicit within 5 feet after they've already had a negative response, doing these other things. The next one is intentionally or recklessly blocking the safe or free passage of the person being solicited or requiring the person or the driver of a vehicle to take evasive action to avoid physical contact with the person making the solicitation. And it has a little caveat that acts authorized as an exercise of one's constitutional right to picket or legally protest, and acts authorized by a business license pursuant to those sections of our code shall not constitute obstruction of pedestrian or vehicular traffic. 2 more. Intentionally or recklessly using obscene or abusive language or gestures. Now, it's important that in and of itself, using obscene or abusive language is technically protected by is protected by the First Amendment, except when there's a line that's crossed. And so if they use obscene or abusive language that is intended to or likely to cause a reasonable person to fear imminent bodily harm or the commission of a criminal act upon property in the person's possession, or words intended to or reasonably likely to intimidate the person into responding affirmatively to the solicitation. It's important on all these you have to have that first part and one of the second parts. And the last one is approaching the person being solicited in a manner that is intended to or is likely to cause a reasonable person to fear imminent bodily harm or the commission of a criminal act upon property in the person's possession, or intended to or is reasonably likely to intimidate the person being solicited into responding affirmatively to the solicitation. So that's the definition of aggressive, and that was the first prohibition under this ordinance, which is aggressive solicitation, whether it's on private property or public property. Now, the next one is on private property specifically. And keep in mind that there is far less protections on private property, as you would imagine, than there are on public property. So this one is solicitation is prohibited as follows. On private property, if the owner, tenant, or lawful occupant has asked the person not to solicit on the property or has posted a sign clearly indicating that solicitations are prohibited on the property. That's pretty clear cut. This is one of the things that private property can do now to, if they're dealing with issues of solicitation on their property, especially aggressive solicitation, is they can prohibit it entirely on their property, the private property. And the third one is from any occupant, or solicitation is prohibited from any occupant of a motor vehicle that is in traffic on a public street if the solicitation would cause any person, and this is the important part, to walk upon a portion of the roadway not clearly designated and or marked for pedestrian foot traffic. On sidewalks and other places that are considered traditional public forum, we cannot regulate speech like solicitation. But once they step into the lanes of traffic, it becomes a public safety issue, especially on our roadways where cars are going faster. And we've seen those issues, and I'll talk about it in a second with some of our pedestrian crash stats, and especially fatalities. But this is really what we're concerned with, is when it either causes the vehicle to do something that could cause a crash, or the pedestrian themselves could be injured from their actions. That goes into our next one, which is 21-63, which is standing or loitering on or near street or highway. And this kind of echoes this last point from 21-62. But the purpose of this section is to prevent dangers to persons and property, to prevent traffic delays, and to avoid interference with traffic flow. Roadways that have center medians often are designed to handle specific traffic flow problems. Any delay or distraction may interfere with traffic planning and may present dangerous roadway conditions for drivers and pedestrians. So what this one prohibits is it shall be unlawful for any person to stand or loiter on a street or highway when such activity, one, causes the person performing the activity to enter onto the traveled portion of a street or highway. That's the portion, again, it'll be at the end of the definition where vehicles actually go to travel. So the places, the lanes where vehicles travel. The person performing the activity is located such that vehicles cannot move into a legal parking area safely. They're blocking that area. C, it shall be unlawful for any person to stand or loiter on any highway included in the interstate system, including any entrance to or exit from the highway. This is on the actual off-ramp or the on-ramp, not on sidewalks or areas that are not in the roadway itself. And for purposes of this section, the traveled portion of the street or highway shall mean the portion of the road normally used by moving motor vehicle traffic. Just to show some crash data on what we've seen, a concerning trend with pedestrians in the last 4 years especially, we've seen the number of pedestrian crashes overall increase fairly drastically, but even more concerning, the number of fatal pedestrian crashes. From a fairly consistent number back when I was in traffic in 2018, 2019, very consistent around 2, 3 at the most that we would see, and now we have numbers as high as 7. And most of those pedestrian fatalities are caused by a pedestrian who enters a roadway in a place other than a crosswalk, or that's a place that's designated for a pedestrian. And so one of the things we're trying to address is to limit these types of injury crashes or fatalities. And oftentimes drugs are associated with these crashes, and I think that's another reason we've seen the increase, because fentanyl arriving in Las Cruces kind of overlays with that as well. Moving along, I'm going to get right into the shopping cart ordinance, which is the one that has a little bit more detail to it. This is a new ordinance, again, not an existing ordinance that we're modifying. And there's several things we're trying to accomplish with a shopping cart ordinance. When this was first brought up, and it was originally brought up by our community outreach officers who really are just in the trenches every day dealing with some of these issues. And they saw the need for it. And it sounded petty or minor, how much of an effect would this really have? But the more you look at it and the more we've seen, the more I've examined it, I truly believe that it would have a positive effect. And I'll explain why here in a few slides. But abandoned shopping carts in the city can potentially hazard the health and safety of the public, interfere with pedestrian and vehicular traffic. We've had many shopping carts in roadways, and create a public nuisance. The accumulation of abandoned carts on public and private property tends to reduce property values and promote blight and deterioration, which results in a public nuisance. And I wish it was limited in scope, but I'll show you some of the projects we've done, which if you saw the town hall or watched it, you kind of already know what those numbers are, but it doesn't take a lot of time to gather a significant amount of carts that are left throughout our city. And I gave this anecdote the other day as well, but I worked a couple hours last week in the evening. I was walking a small desert area between a residential and a commercial area, not looking for shopping carts, but I came across 2 shopping carts full of property, nobody around, full of trash, and not even looking for them. They ultimately make our problem and our problems in the city appear much worse. And this perception is not helpful for anyone. Oftentimes, the closer we can get perception to reality of those two things to match, the better it is for everybody when we're making decisions, whether it's those that are homeless, the service providers, the police, the public, the businesses. When we're dealing with the facts, we can come up with solutions that are meaningful and actually have a positive effect. When perception is way off from reality, we tend to do a whole lot of yelling and screaming and not accomplish much, because we're not starting from an accurate place. And I already gave this away if you saw the town hall, but what I asked the people at the town hall to raise their fingers for how many people they thought were in this encampment, and I got a number between 4 and 10. I think 4 was the lowest I saw. And the reality is this was ultimately one person's encampment. There's multiple shopping carts that are there. You can see the one in the front, there's several in the back. And when someone drives by this, including me, if I drove by this, I would think there's 5, 6, 10, 12 people in this encampment, when the reality is just one person. And so that perception being way out of scope with reality is not helpful for us or anybody else in the city. How bad is the problem? For us to understand the need for this ordinance, we have to understand the extent of the problem in the city. So I'm going to play a quick video, no sound. What I want you to do, if possible, is try to count the number of carts that are involved in this video. A couple things. The answer is 14, for those that are wondering, 14 carts. On the left is a picture of all the resources that took to clean up this area, including mano a mano. And this is all from one person. This is one person with 14 carts, full of some property, some personal property, but also a lot of stuff that's objectively trash, which to them may be property, but ultimately, I'll talk about in a minute, it makes it very difficult to help this person because they are tied like an anchor to this property, to this trash, and it makes it hard to move them anywhere, including to services. But when people pass by and they see 14 carts full of stuff, the perception, of course, is not that there's one person there. It's that there's 5, 10, 14 people there. I'm going to go through a series of photos, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time. These are all from Las Cruces over the last, these are from the 2020 operation, but most of them are fairly recent. And just to highlight the extent of the problem, several operations have been done by our community outreach section, along with codes and other, both city departments, mano a mano, and other organizations, to try to clean up the abandoned carts. One of the first projects was in August of 2020, lasted only 5 hours, and they recovered 152 carts valued at $50,395, based on the estimates from the different retailers on what they pay for each cart. So a significant amount in 5 hours. And there's been others between, but I highlight one of the first projects and the last, just to kind of bookmark the issue. This operation last week, April 23rd, lasted only 2 hours. And in those 2 hours, with the help of all these different organizations and departments, 162 carts were collected in 2 hours, valued at $32,180. And here's a breakdown of where we saw those carts come from. Again, these are all abandoned carts. These are not taken from anybody. But these are abandoned carts, very often full of trash and with debris and trash all around them. And so like streets and public works, they're not really doing anything with the carts, but they have to come in along with mano a mano to help pick up all the trash and debris and fill truckloads of it around these areas. I'll get into the details of the ordinance. I'm going to try to simplify it as much as possible. Of course, with questions, we can get into any part of it. But the ordinance sets up several requirements for retail businesses that utilize shopping carts. So some of those requirements are affixing an identifying sign on each cart. And what that sign does, it tells us which business it is, which specific location or store number, and a contact number for pickup if it's found abandoned. The other thing they have to do is submit a shopping cart plan every 2 years, which has to be approved through community development. And I'll go into kind of the details of what the shopping cart plan entails. But there is a caveat unless they apply for an exemption and are approved, which I'll also talk about in a second. And then in that case, they would not have to do the shopping cart plan. The shopping cart plan has several different components. The first is kind of identifying information, contact information for the business. The next is the number of carts that they have and how they intend to comply with the sign requirement on the carts. The next is public notices. It's important, obviously, for public education. So that could be a number of things. Signs on the shopping cart corrals that say, if you take it, it's unlawful, it's a crime. On the business itself, they can do printing on receipts. There's a bunch of different ways to comply, and usually a combination is best. The next part is a loss prevention or description of the measures that business owners will implement to prevent the removal of carts. This can include security guards that are outside in the parking lots to help prevent people from taking carts. It can include surveillance trailers like we have that some of the retailers have. And again, it's a combination of things, preferably, that help reduce the number of carts taken. The next part is a cart retrieval plan for them to collect off-site shopping carts at least once a week and within 3 days of notification by the city of an abandoned cart. And then the last part is how they kind of implement all the parts before that. The exemptions, and this is an important part. There are businesses in town already that would qualify for these exemptions, would essentially have to do nothing other than apply for the exemption and get it approved every 2 years. In order to qualify for an exemption, both parts have to be met. So number one is that they have effective restraints that prohibit any carts from exiting the premise. So examples generally are poles attached to the carts. I'll show a picture. I think everyone knows what I'm talking about. Electric wheel locks, where there's a perimeter system. If the cart passes a point in the parking lot, the wheels lock, and it makes it difficult to roll that cart. Courtesy clerks, which is something that Save Mart, which is one of our smaller grocers, but already does. They have somebody that escorts everybody to their car, helps them load the groceries, and then brings the cart back. So Save Mart, if this is passed, would have to do essentially nothing other than every 2 years just apply for their exemption and get it approved. The business also has to secure all shopping carts during the hours the business is closed by storing them inside or locking them outside, or finding some other way to prevent people from taking them after hours. So both parts have to be done to qualify for an exemption. So some examples, a lot of the smaller stores like Dollar General, Family Dollar, Dollar Tree, a lot of those stores where people aren't taking or getting a ton of stuff might be able to put the poles on there to prevent them going into the parking lot. Whereas a lot of other stores, people need to get their groceries to the car, and the cart is the way they do that. So the wheel lock system is another possible option. And then, of course, attendance, like I mentioned, with Save Mart. The second part of the ordinance is really all in one, but the other prohibitions that are in the ordinance is it makes it unlawful for a person to do these things. Remove a shopping cart from the retail premise where it is used for shopping purposes. Possess an off-site shopping cart not subject to an exception identified in this article. Abandon an off-site shopping cart, or alter, convert, or tamper with a shopping cart, or remove any part or portion thereof, or remove, obliterate, or alter any identifying sign, mark, or serial number on a shopping cart. Now, it is important to point out, and I'll mention it again, that all these things are technically already illegal. Not even technically, they are already illegal, either under possession of stolen property, larceny, or criminal damage to property. So these are not new crimes per se, they're already illegal. The enforcement part of the ordinance allows for enforcement of the ordinance under several different provisions of municipal code that are permitted by law, which includes revocation of an exemption under subsection 5, the exemptions we just talked about, the requirement that the owner abide by conditions of a new shopping cart plan, with terms to be dictated by the administrator. The administrator comes from community development. Prosecution as a petty misdemeanor under the authority of Las Cruces Municipal Code 1-10. Imposition of a fine of not less than $100, no more than $500 for a first violation, $200, no more than $500 for a second violation within a 365-day period, and $500 for each additional violation within a 365-day period. Procedures for abatement of a nuisance under sections 18-5 and 18-7 of the Las Cruces Municipal Code. A civil action for enforcement, including to abate a public nuisance by injunctive relief or any other court order, and proceedings for revocation of a use or site development permit if applicable. And one of the things that's important to mention is that a business license in Las Cruces is contingent on not being in violation of other municipal ordinances or codes. So if there's a violation of the shopping cart plan, at some point that could be a remedy as well. Another caveat that's in the ordinance itself, it says at the discretion of the sentencing judge, any person convicted on this article may perform community service in lieu of any fine imposed by the court. And by community service, one of the options for community service in New Mexico is treatment, whether for mental illness or substance use or both. So that would be ultimately the goal, is that this is a mechanism, if necessary, to plug people into services that need them the most. So that's the ordinance, the nuts and bolts of it. Why is this ordinance important? I mentioned already that theft is already a crime. We could take enforcement action right now. If that was the goal was enforcement, we could do that right now. That's not the goal. The goal is to have a holistic approach to try to make Las Cruces better, and enforcement by itself will not just accomplish that. It has to be a number of things together. Another point that I think that's really important, as soon as we justify and excuse any crime, we compromise the entire system. And we are talking about something that is already a crime, it's theft. If somebody went into somebody's open garage or carport and stole a wagon to carry their property around town, I don't think we would excuse that. I think we would consider that a crime and that there should be some action taken to return that property to the owner. If someone went into Walmart and shoplifted a wagon, the same type of wagon, to carry property, we'd probably see that a little bit differently than the shopping cart itself. But ultimately, the crime is the same, except for the fact that the shopping cart is actually worth more than the wagon itself. There are several businesses with no carts or few carts available. It may seem like a minor point, and it is just one of the reasons for this ordinance, but even Walmart, sometimes it's difficult to find carts because of the number of carts that are taken from Walmart. You saw how many were recovered in that 2-hour period just from Walmart's. But when people go to a business and there's no carts available, it is something that impacts both the business and the customer, which is our citizens. It makes a bad situation in our city appear even worse, and this is a negative for all parties. I already hit on it, but I do think the perception of the problems we face being inflated is not a good thing for us. We do have issues with homelessness. We do have issues with crime, substance use, untreated mental illness. But we need to try to have that perception in check with reality, and a lot of times these things inflate it. Shopping carts contribute to blight and unhealthy conditions. We do find shopping carts that are just by themselves empty, but a lot of times what we find is a shopping cart full of trash, surrounded by trash and other items that are hazardous, biohazards. And so there's this, it goes along with the territory. When we find abandoned shopping carts, we tend to find a lot of trash and debris associated with it. Shopping carts full of stuff limit the mobility of those who are homeless and their access to services. I mentioned it earlier, but I really believe it. And I think it's a point that's overlooked, that when you have someone, especially those who suffer from mental illness or addiction, meth addiction, oftentimes schizophrenia, is associated with hoarding behavior. And so they will have those 14 carts full of cardboard and other trash. That to them is property. I've seen it before where I've had people take trash bags out of trash cans and store it in the shopping cart and take it with them for days because that's their property. But ultimately what that does is become an anchor to try to get them to the services. When you have someone with 14 carts and they're 5 miles from Community of Hope where we can get them services or any other service provider, good luck getting them those 5 miles with 14 carts. It's very difficult. If enforcement action is taken, which is not the first course of action, is ultimately an opportunity to plug them into treatment through municipal courts, very soon to be SOS program. And that is, again, not the first course of action, but if that is the end result for somebody, then hopefully it's still an opportunity to plug them into the services that they would not get on their own. And at that point, I hope some good can come out of it. I have a lot of confidence in Judge Velosa, and I do want to say that on the record, that he's already doing what he can within the framework, but I think very soon with the addition of the case manager and a few compliance personnel, ankle monitoring is a part of it because that allows us to have some options on pretrial release. But I'm hopeful that that will be a mechanism to help a lot of these people that we see over and over and over, especially for the petty crimes. Some final thoughts. This is not about punishing people who are homeless. It's not about criminalizing homelessness. It's criminalizing crime. It's criminalizing theft. There are options if a cart is taken from someone, working with our nonprofits. And as we do this, a lot of times it's going to be operation-based. A patrol officer, if they pass by somebody with a cart, if this is passed, is not generally going to have the time to stop and try to deal with that, whether they wanted to or not. So it's going to be a targeted effort with community outreach codes, Mano y Mano, and others to try to address this. And that could be a holistic approach when we do it, so that we have resources when we take the cart, deal with that person, but that could be outreach team from Community of Hope, that could be potentially personnel from fire based on time and personnel, and try to even offer an alternative for their property, for their essential property, so they have a mechanism to carry it around. One of the goals of the ordinance, one of the main goals of the ordinance, is to limit the hoarding of trash that contributes to blight, but it also impairs people's access to services and mobility, which I've mentioned several times, but I wanted to end on that point. And the question is, how do these people get to their service appointments? Either they leave their property there, which oftentimes it's not there when they return, or they're afraid to leave it, or they tried to tow this around with them across town. And it becomes that anchor to them getting help and doing better for themselves. At this point, I will stand for questions.